broadcasting.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Georgia Department of Economic Development and the Technology Association of Georgia's collaboration, the Georgia Defense Industrial Base Task Force. Today is our fourth webinar in a series that focuses on CMMC, and we're going to take a moment to let everyone get settled. We have updated the link to the Zoom, so if you notice that there's someone who is not participating, who you're aware of, that would like to, we'll give them a few moments to join because, again, we did update the Zoom link a few moments ago. And I'll take that time to tell you a little bit about today, about the task force, and about the resources available to defense contractors here in Georgia before I send it over to our panelists and my colleague at the task force, Roy Hadley. So the Georgia Defense Industrial Base Task Force, as I mentioned, is a collaboration between the Georgia Department of Economic Development and the Technology Association of Georgia. The task force creates monthly events, programming, and educational resources to help businesses here work towards CMMC. My name is Cassia Baker, and I am the project manager for the Georgia Department of Economic Development's Centers of Innovation for Aerospace. I am focused on the CMMC outreach effort here in Georgia, and I'll give you my contact information at the end of the broadcast. I'd love to hear from you and would be happy to help. Some resources you should be aware of here in Georgia are a site called the Cybersecurity Edge site, which was developed by the Georgia Department of Economic Development and has links to resources and support around CMMC. It can be accessed at georgia.org/cybersecurityedge. Another good resource is the Georgia Defense Exchange, GDX tool, which is a business development tool for contractors here. And lastly, you should keep an eye on the TAG online site, particularly their calendar, where we have an upcoming October webinar, as well as a November panel that focuses on cybersecurity. The task force also has a link to our group if you'd like to learn more. You can visit that at tagonline.org/GA-DIBT. Today we're joined by my colleague at the task force, Roy Hadley Jr., who is a special counsel at Adams and Reese LLP. He also chairs the InfoSec Society at TAG. He has 30 years experience in the field. He focuses on cybersecurity, privacy, and data management, and he's going to be moderating today. We're also joined today by teammates from Tyanic. We have Brad Moriarty, who's the general manager, as well as Jason Holmes, who is the IT director. We are also joined today by George Pryor, who is the Vice President of Information Security at the WBB Inc. We are delighted to have these guests here, and I'm going to send it over to Roy to introduce our panelists.
Cassia, thank you so much for everything. Thanks for that great introduction. Welcome, everyone. As Cassia said, this is our fourth iteration of panels, discussions on CMMC. And we're happy that you have joined us today. Our goal today is really to talk to people that are on the front lines of trying to implement CMMC, people that are in the Defense Department supply chain. If you're on this call, then you probably know what CMMC is, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, which, as you know, is requiring all suppliers and contractors in the Department of Defense supply chain to have a certification at various levels of CMMC, either levels 1 through 5, with 5 being, kind of top secret stuff, 1 being basic certification, basic cyber hygiene, and then level 3, which is roughly the equivalent of NIST 800 and 171. But, in past iterations, we've talked about level 1 certification. We've talked about other things. We've had members from the CMMC AB on. But today we're going to talk about kind of what you need to know and hear from the front line, lessons from the front line. These companies that we have here today are actually implementing CMMC. So at various levels, and we'll talk about that. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Jason to just kind of briefly introduce himself. We'll follow that with Brad, and then lastly, surely not least, George. Just a quick introduction of you and what your company does. Jason.
Thank you for, for having us. I'm Jason Holmes. I'm the Director of IT for Tynick Native Corporations.
And okay, come on, Jason. You gotta give me a little bit more than that. So tell us a little bit about what Tynick does and kind of what industries you all are in. And
Yeah.
if you don't tell me, I'll lean on Brad to fill in a little bit.
Yeah, Tynick Native Corporation is an Alaska Native corporation, and we're a parent company to many sub companies that deal in the DoD defense arena. That's mostly what our work involves is defense contracting. So with that, we have to abide by NIST 800-171 and the new CMMC Compliance.
Okay, fantastic. Brad, you want to fill us in a little bit more? Now, you are also with Tynick, but I think in a different area.
Sure, yes. I'm the general manager in our Warner Robins location on the manufacturing side. So our company has kind of two seats to the organization. We have a services organization and a manufacturing organization. We manufacture, all sorts of electronics, cable assemblies, aircraft harnesses, all sorts of just kind of widgets out there. We also have a software engineering specialty here in Warner Robins where we do a lot of design work, test program set, automatic testing, and all that kind of stuff here. And our services division is basically personnel sitting on site for contractual support and whatnot at different DoD locations.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. All right, George, Whitney, Bradley, and Brown, WBB. Tell us a little bit about them and a little bit about you.
Thanks, Roy. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me on the program. I'm the Vice President of IT, Head of IT for Whitney, Bradley, and Brown, WBB. Like Brad, we're a professional services organization, and our primary customer is the Department of Defense. We provide logistical support around program management, program execution. In fact, we have an office in Warner Robins where we have folks that are on post at Warner Robins supporting various activities. We do not manufacture anything other than intellectual capital for the United States government. And as a result, obviously, we're a custodian of information that we produce and hold and have had to abide by 800-171 and have started our CMMC program.
Okay, fantastic. So one order of housekeeping that I did want to mention before we kind of get into the conversation here, and that is if you are out there and you're listening and you have questions, if you could just use the chat feature, put your questions there. We will be monitoring the chat throughout the program and we'll answer those questions or present those questions to the panelists. So if you look in the chat feature, just put your questions there and we will make sure they get answered. So I'm going to go to you, George, first. Last in the introductions, first in the questions. So, you mentioned that you were required to adhere to, kind of NIST 800-171 and those. I read a statistic and, the one I read said 43%, some were lower than that, some a little bit higher, but essentially it said that in the past when you had to self-certify under DFARS that you were, meeting these requirements, only, 43% or lower actually met the requirements, but self-certified. Have you seen out there that that's a problem? Do you think that's a real statistic just based on anecdotal evidence that you may have seen? Or do you think most people that self-certified really did meet those requirements? And where I'm going is really whether CMMC is in fact needed.
So I can't question 43%, but I do know when you look at the control items and as an organization, you make a value judgment whether you meet the criteria. And when you self-certify, it gives you a little bit of wiggle room around what you believe is in scope and what's out of scope. And do you fully meet the controls? The advantage in my mind around an independent audit is that the audit is conducted by a party that knows the framework, and in this particular case, CMMC, and therefore holds you accountable around those control items and the artifacts. I actually think it's a good thing that this is being implemented. It's painful because it requires you to revalidate all your information, but to have an independent third-party accreditation and audit will actually put some teeth into this and ensure that there is adherence to this program. So from my perspective, it's well needed, given that self-certification is not in any other audit framework. If you look at SOC, PCI, high trust and everything, those are all certified audits. So if you're dealing with the DoD, you would think that they would also have accredited audits. So I'm glad they're doing it.
Yeah. And Brad, you know, from your perspective, I know, you know, I'll ask you to comment on that statistic also, but I know that you all are in various industries. And so for you, are you seeing any reluctance from your partners in those various industries on the CMMC, or is everybody kind of adopting it, you know, for what it is?
Sure. I mean, I think on our end, you know, we prime a lot of work, and then those that we are a sub to tend to have the same flow down in terms of the DoD contracts and things like that. A lot of our flow downs don't really, we don't flow down that kind of information because most of the work we can do in-house. So we haven't had to deal with smaller companies yet that aren't compliant that I'm aware of, and Jason might know a little more than me, but at this point we have yet to deal with any other smaller subcontractors that aren't compliant or that we've even had to deal with.
So Jason, I will pivot to you. You know, that, and Brad brought up a great point, and that is those smaller subs that you're having to deal with that, you know, supply you, and then you obviously go on to the DoD. What are you seeing out there? Are you seeing kind of this feeling of, okay, we have to get on this thing, or are there some challenges that you're hearing of from partners that are out there with respect to CMMC?
Well, you know, just like with NIST, it's still pretty new, and a lot of companies with NIST 800, 171 obviously put it off to the last minute. And, you know, going back to what you were talking about originally with the percentage numbers, and we don't know the accurate numbers, but for companies that have self-certified, I would say it's even lower than that. I would predict that only 30% are actually fully compliant with NIST. There's just so many, there's costs involved, you know, there's complexity to the controls, and they're so generically written that a lot of times, even, you know, even as an IT professional, you don't really know what those controls mean. So as George mentioned, you know, we also highly recommend that companies, you know, bring in an independent auditing company that knows what they're doing to do an audit. But for the smaller companies, you know, they're the ones getting hit the hardest with this. I do agree with George. I think it's a good thing. Otherwise, you're going to have defense contractors out there doing things like, you know, file sharing with Dropbox and things that are not secure, not, you know, not in a FedRAMP compliant data center. And that happens probably every day. And so all that data, it's insecure. It's sitting out there in the cloud, and, you know, who knows who's hacking that information as we speak.
Right. Right. And, you know, I'm going to stay with you here for a second, Jason, because one of the things, you know, you brought up some great points, but I do want to say you mentioned the concept of bringing in an independent auditor, and you're talking about bringing that auditor in before you seek CMMC certification to try to help you figure out where you are and get up to speed, or what are you thinking there?
Yeah, I believe that's well, one, you know, if you've self-certified with NIST, I still would highly recommend that you bring in a security company to audit your NIST compliance, because the CMMC is going to, you know, is going to come off of the NIST. So if you're not compliant with NIST controls, then you're definitely not going to be compliant with the CMMC audit, which is now required. So yeah, I highly recommend that every company, and it's not that expensive to bring somebody in and actually look at their processes and their policies and make sure they're fully compliant with NIST before they move to the CMMC. Once they're done with that, then they can bring that same company in to do the CMMC audit.
Okay. Yeah, and that's a great point, because I think a lot of companies that have self-certified, may not have a full grasp of what is actually going to be required under CMMC and when you bring those third-party auditors in. So George, I'm going to pivot to you here for a second. What are you seeing out there? I mean, in terms of, or hearing in terms of challenges with respect to CMMC, either within your organization or outside of it? Because I think there are some challenges that I will mention, but I'd love to hear from you on challenges that you're hearing out there, like I say, either within your company or externally with respect to CMMC.
Absolutely. One thing I want to, before I answer your question, echo what Jason mentioned. We actually did that. We did a CMMC PreAssessment, which essentially runs you through a audit. And it pointed out that there were some areas that we needed to address. And to answer your question specifically, Roy, we completed our plan of action and milestones in June of 2018, and it is now obviously September of 2020. 2 years have passed, things have changed.
Right.
So you've got to pull some things off of the shelf and look at things and read the language between 800-171 and CMMC. As I talk to my peers in the national capital area, because there's a lot of us, Beltway bandits as they call us, the biggest challenge that we have, there's obviously always technical challenges, but a lot of the technical controls have all been implemented. It is the documentation and making sure that your SSP, system security plan, your incident response plan, and all of the artifacts that the auditor is going to say, Jason, you say you do this, now show me. And then they're going to pull something out. We've all done audits, and the moment you give the auditor a filing cabinet or electronic information, they're going to laser focus on the one that you didn't expect them to focus. And then it all starts to unravel, if you will. So it's almost a good thing that as an organization, you go through, and my peers have said this, is they're not dreading, but they're expecting that the first audit, because this is a new audit framework, will probably be a pass with an exclamation point with a remediation. So whatever you can do is, if you can go and self-audit and read those controls, I highly recommend it. We are actually using a framework around, it's built on a web-based platform where you can collect and put everything in there. It's from a company called Aptega, and Aptega stores that and it lets you build everything. It's not cheap, but what it does is it centralizes everything and it gets it out of Excel. I love Excel, but it's a way of putting everything in there and assigning tasks to people so you can track your compliance journey. And that, of course, to close out with that question, is it's yet another mandate on an IT and security folks that are already stretched pretty thin. So this doesn't come without its associated costs of staff time. It doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Right. Great points. And that made me think of something. And so, Brad, I'm going to move over to you. Is, as you said that you all prime a lot of things out. Are you concerned from a prime perspective with respect to your subs and CMMC compliance? And I'm not going to ask what you are doing necessarily, so I'm going to give you an out before I ask the question. But what are some of the things that primes could be thinking about or should be thinking about with respect to CMMC compliance in their subs?
I mean, basically sending out letters on compliance when they're anticipating running through the audit, where they're at on their status, specifically ones that we do a lot of business with. They need to be aware, if they're not, I would hope that they're already aware that this is here and coming, that what their status is, because in order to have that, for us to do business with them, it's going to be a requirement. It's going to be flowed down on every subcontract that we have.
Right. And so, I know there is this concept out there that I've heard, that it's going to take, 3 or 4 years to really roll CMMC out. But for those subs that are thinking, well, I've got 2 or 3 years to go, what would you say to them?
Just like Jason and George said, I mean, it's one of these things, do not wait to the last minute. It's going to be painful. You need to take the time now to get it out of the way and work through all your processes.
Okay. So I am going to pivot here because in the Q&A, there are a couple of questions. So, one question, and I'll open this up to all three of you, is, if you are out there in the DoD supply chain, how do you determine what level of CMMC compliance that you will have to adhere to? You have levels 1 through 5, 3 being, again, equivalent roughly to NIST 800-171. So if somebody is out there, and George, I'll let you start, what do you think, how can somebody kind of start that process of determining what level or levels should I be compliant with or try to get to?
So I'm going to give you my perspective, and it's from a security perspective. So take it for that.
Okay.
I would start at the highest level. And the reason I would say it's better to start at the highest level, and then as you go through those controls, then you can make a decision and you can document that decision as to why you chose not to in-scope something. If you start at, let's say, level 3, and then your business changes, you might end up realizing that you should have gone for that highest level, and then you're non-compliant. So it's easier, and as Brad said, it's painful, and that's why you want to start early, but it's better to start at the highest level, because to me, security, especially in this space, I'd rather be overprotected than be underprotected.
Okay. Jason, love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with George, but we're going to go with the level 4. We know that we're very secure with our NIST compliance, and we were, I guess you could say, a little bit overkill, like George recommended, on our systems and hardware that we put in place to monitor stuff. And so we're pretty strong already. So we know level 4 is not going to be that difficult for us. But if somebody who has not had an independent audit, it's going to be, like George said, it's going to be very painful. There's going to be cost involved. But now you have no choice. Where before you could self-certify, now you can't. So kind of one thing I didn't mention with the NIST compliance for us, we were a sub under a prime, and the prime got audited by DCMA for their subs compliance. And so they went to a sub of this prime, and I actually talked to the DCMA auditor, and he told me that this company is self-certified and they were absolutely 0% compliant. And so when they saw that, they hit up all the prime subs, and we were one of them. So we got an audit by DCMA on our NIST compliance. And I can assure you, it was not a quick go over our policies and procedures. They dug in very deep. We had to make a few changes to our policies, but they were very stringent on that audit. So the good thing about CMMC is going to eliminate that, having the fear of being audited by DCMA and possibly losing the contract. So now you're going to be forced to do it. You're going to have an independent audit done. So,
right.
But I agree with George. I think you need to go as high as possible. That's not going to break the bank.
Right. And that brings up a great point. We're talking about, for a lot of small to mid-sized organizations, cost, of the certification. And the cost can be broken down into kind of, as you all were saying, that pre-audit, then the work that actually has to be done, and then, actually going through the certification process itself. So Brad, are you hearing anything from your subs around the costs, and is that going to be, do you think that's going to be an issue for them? And if so, how can they address that? Or is everybody just pretty much saying, hey, it is what it is, and we have to comply, so we'll find the monies somewhere?
Yeah, so I've talked to a couple manufacturers, not just people that we just deal with, friends and things like that. It's kind of both that it's one of these that it's what it is, and we're going to have to deal with it. And some are actually, changing their focus on what they're actually going to go after. If it's going to be continued DoD work, if they're going to go more on the commercial side of things and kind of break away just in terms of the overall costs. I mean, you keep adding all these different, factors. You got the AS9100 search, you got the CMMC search, you got CMMI. I mean, it's just kind of at what point do you no longer afford to do this kind of work? And that's just something that each company has to kind of take on and understand for themselves.
Right. So, and interesting, that's a great point. And I'm asking for your gut feeling, your anecdotal, kind of thoughts here. I mean, do you think that we're going to lose a significant percentage or percentage of companies, especially small to mid-size, out of the DoD supply chain because of CMMC?
I mean, yeah, I absolutely feel like you're going to see definitely people pulling away from it, or just, maybe a delay in terms of when they're going to actually get it accomplished. I think for the first couple of years, you're going to definitely see a lot of smaller companies not having it.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. And I would not necessarily disagree with that. So George, let me ask you, you talked about going for the highest level, but you didn't quite say what level you all were going for. So am I assuming that you're, for your company, WBB, that you're starting at 5 and kind of working down from there?
That is correct, Roy. Just like Jason said, we're very comfortable to go for 4, but I'd rather start at 5 and make sure and see where we land. That way, if we decide to go and pivot down to 4, we've thoughtfully done that. Sometimes I think there's some other objectives that we need to achieve around it that drive the business. Security helps drive investments as well, especially in the space that we're in. So sometimes you can leverage that impetus to add some additional controls that you want to put in there. I would also add to your point around cost. There's the cost of not doing this as well. And, you look at the results of the average value associated with an event or an incident, and it's a healthy 7-figure amount. And as Brad has pointed out, there are companies that are going to make value-based decisions whether the investment justifies going after business. You mentioned various certifications. I happen to be part of a red team where we were looking at bidding on something, and we have a CMMI certification, but it wasn't at the right level, and upping it was not the investment, especially around the P-win of getting it. We decided that we're not going to make that investment. So just because you're a larger company, you do make strategic decisions, and the DoD in their various solicitations does award points, for example, around various certifications. And if you don't have those certifications, you may not have the maximum amount of points to have your bid be considered. So you're absolutely right. There's money involved, and suppliers will eventually, feel that if they have to spend all of this money to compete, they may choose not to.
Interesting point. Very interesting point. And so, it will be interesting to see kind of as CMMC shakes out over the next few years, kind of what percent we lose out of the supply chain. And to your other point, whether they should be out of the supply chain. So Jason, I'm going to ask you, in terms of you actually implementing CMMC at your company, what have been some of the challenges? Because I think a lot of people on this call, this webinar, are really interested in kind of what are some of those day-to-day challenges that you're seeing in actually implementing it. Are the guidelines clear enough? Are you able to look at it and say, okay, I can do this on the front end based upon what they're asking me? And do you really think that's going to translate into actually being certified once the C3PAOs are stood up? So, day to day, kind of what are some of those nuts and bolts challenges that you're seeing in CMMC implementation?
Well, as usual, the government the way they write things, it's super high level. It's very generic.
Right.
And if you don't have, somebody, I could spend, well, just like for the NIST, I spent a good year and a half working on that, trying to do it myself. And, turned out we were pretty much 99% compliant, but I still, was worried that there were some things we were missing. So that's when we decided to bring in a consulting group to do an independent audit. But those things, especially the high level writings, it's hard to understand what technically they mean.
Right.
And that's been an issue. That's always going to be an issue. And that's why I think, bringing in a third party auditor is going to be a requirement now. Other than that, that's really been the hardest thing for us.
It's just figuring that out.
Right.
Gotcha. What about you, George?
I would echo what Jason says. If you feel good about your NIST self-certification, then you've dealt with probably one of the most challenging aspects, and that is investing your employees and your staff and potentially your partners in it, right? Because making sure that you have all those controls for NIST implemented required you to change things that your employees typically they push back. So if you feel good about having crossed that hurdle from a change management perspective internally, it is not as challenging. If you are just now starting, you're going to have to cross that Rubicon and make sure that you and my advice to anyone embarking on this is let your staff know that you're doing this and that change is coming so that they understand the implications of that. In terms of, how you ultimately do the implementation, I think the area that will also require any organization in IT is to partner with the other business units, especially in business operations. There's a lot of overlap. And I specifically mentioned identity and access management because, as an organization that hires, a fair amount of people and offboards a fair amount of people, dealing with a robust identity and access management program, I guarantee you the auditors are going to ask you about that, is how you do separation of information access and role-based access, as well as making sure that you have control over what information has been put into your systems and properly tagged. And that's also a training of your end users. You really need to train them that each piece of information should be properly categorized.
Okay, great points. What about you, Jason? I'm gonna pivot back to you here for a second. George mentioned some very specific things that he thought were going to be kind of focuses of the auditors once those C3PAOs are finally stood up and are out there certifying. Are there any areas that you think people need to pay particular attention to?
Well, cloud, cloud is it's the new up and coming thing. And, there's probably a lot of companies that have services in the cloud, but yet they're probably not FedRAMP compliant clouds. Some people may not even know what that means. So if you're storing, CUI information in a cloud system that is not FedRAMP compliant, you're not compliant. There's all kinds of things, just locking down, like George said, if you're just now implementing stuff, wait till you lock down the USB ports on the computers. Just that alone, that can throw a wrench in a lot of things. Multi-factor authentication for your computers, that's a big one that most people ignore or is too costly to implement. And those are just some of the few things that you have to look for.
Gotcha. So great points. I particularly like my USB ports on my computer. So, let's not talk about that too much. It's, out on this webinar, I like my USB ports. So, Brad, I'm going to pivot to you here for a second. And the question that I have for you is, as CMMC AB, the CMMC AB, the accreditation body, there have been some changes in it, recently. I know there's a new chairman who used to be the vice chairman, Carlton Johnson. We actually had him on one of our earlier webinars to talk about CMMC AB. You know, are you at all concerned? I know TINEC is going to be compliant, and we'll get there because you're in great hands with Jason. But are you concerned, kind of from a big picture standpoint, that the CMMC AB may not be ready to certify everybody and get everybody ready to be bidding on those DoD contracts? Do you think that's, from a business standpoint, it's going to cause any issues with you, or are you hearing anything out there like that?
I mean, our IT department does a wonderful job, I think, keeping us up to date on all of the requirements that come about in any change orders that happen because of them. I'm assuming as the changes come out and you're already certified, it's just one of those, I don't know how they're going to implement it, maybe self-certifying later, or it just comes up as a yearly requirement. But for us, I'm not that concerned. Once I think we have it, the changes after that are going to be minimal.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so good point. So not concerned yet.
Not yet.
I'm putting words in your mouth.
Yeah.
All right. So now I'm going to ask you gentlemen to put on your crystal ball, because one of the things that people say is, well, okay, let's just pick level 3 CMMC certification. How much will that cost me? You know, and so I'm going to ask, put on your crystal ball, give me your best wag on how much it might cost an organization to get to CMMC level 3 certification. So Jason, I'm going to start with you.
Well, like I said, for the NIST, I think I went a little bit up. Well, not overboard. I think, like George said earlier, I would rather be more secure than not secure, you know. So we did the right thing. There was a lot of pieces, you know, hardware, you know, the multi-factor authentication, that's a cost. The SIM, which is, you know, you need to have a system that collects all logs and events from every single device on your network. That's a cost. I'm trying to think of some other stuff that we purchased. If I remember correctly, with the consult, you know, with the independent audit for the NIST, I think we probably spent around 150,000, maybe 200,000, and of course we have yearly costs for the software renewals. So that's, you know, that's a forever cost that we're going to have.
Right.
But I do know that, of course, I like to kind of keep our stuff under our control. But I know a lot of the security consulting companies, they do offer, you know, kind of managed services where they'll come in and manage your compliance for you. They'll provide cloud solutions, you know, such as multi-factor authentication. So, but it is a software as a service. It's a monthly cost that you'll forever have to pay. You're not going to get rid of it. So I just didn't like that model. I prefer to be in control of my own IT hardware and services. So that's why we kind of went with all our stuff's pretty much on premise, but we are in the government cloud now with email and SharePoint and that kind of stuff. But yeah, it was not cheap, and it's still not cheap. But I think the software as a service type model with the security consulting groups is, for smaller companies, probably the way to go.
Okay, great point, Sarah, because I think a lot of times, you know, CMMC certification is said to last for 3 years. That's kind of the plan right now. But, you know, so I think in a lot of people's minds, they're saying, okay, well, the cost of getting certified, I won't have to deal with until 3 years from now, recertified probably 3 years from now. But, and I think you're very correct in reminding people that, you know, there are yearly costs associated with it, even if you're not factoring in the cost of being recertified. So I think that's a great point that people need to keep in mind with respect to CMMC certification. So George, I'm going to pivot to you, make you dust off your crystal ball here, and give us your thoughts on the same question.
So Jason's absolutely right. There's the upfront costs, the investments, if you will. He mentioned the SIM. He mentioned MFA. There's probably the cost of moving things into GCC high for either Azure or AWS, right? There's transition costs. Then there's the care and feeding. SaaS is a beautiful thing, but it's also a recurring hit on your budget. So you've got to balance that out. And if you look at Azure commercial or Office 365 commercial versus Azure GCC high, it's about 30% more expensive. So if you're in that FedRAMP cloud space, you're paying a premium. And that's because those costs are directly passed on to you by Microsoft and Amazon and presumably Google and everything. So from a budget perspective, you need to budget for this. The other part that's really important is that when you buy new tools, you need to make sure that your staff is able to support those. Jason mentioned a SIM, right? Well, a SIM is an expensive acquisition, can be an expensive acquisition, but what's even more expensive is the person that sets up your SIM and that manages the SIM and potentially that interfaces with your help desk system and all of those different things, because it's going to generate a lot of noise at first, and then you're going to need to manage that. So, you know, it's not just buying technology, it's not just buying or getting consultants, but there's a possibility you may have to increase your staff by adding some FTEs. And you can, as Jason said, outsource that. I too am not that big of a fan of doing that, especially when it comes around security. It's great for targeted projects. So crystal ball, it's a healthy six-figure amount, depending on the size of your business and where you are in your journey. It could be higher than a six-figure amount, depending on how big you are. So,
wow. Okay. All right. Those crystal balls are humming right now. So Brad, hearing that as a general manager, what's your thought process around that when, you know, the Jasons and the Georges of the world come to you and say, hey, we need to increase budget in order to meet this CMMC? What's your decision tree? What are your thoughts around supporting that and coming up with the dollars necessary to support those types of endeavors?
Sure. I'll be honest, I wasn't part of the initial, that's kind of a little above me in terms of that budgeting, but really what it comes down to is it's a requirement. It was decided years ago with the NIST that we were going to budget for this and set it aside and build it into, you know, our yearly cost of doing business. And that's really what it is. And that's how we got there. Gotcha.
So, you know, from Tynex's standpoint, you're just saying, hey, look, it is what it is, and we just have to kind of get there.
Right.
Okay. So, you know, as we kind of get towards the end of our time here, and we have a couple more questions that we'll get to, but I do want to, I always find it very useful to just kind of go around the room or around the virtual room here and just ask you, you know, what are your general thoughts on CMMC, and what are some of the words of wisdom that you would give to somebody that is trying to implement CMMC? A lot of it we've already covered, but you know, sometimes the questions are asked are so directed that you just don't get to that point, you know, in your mind where you say, oh, I wish I had told him this, or I wish I had said that, but Roy just didn't ask me that. So, you know, with that in mind, you know, I'll go around the room. I'll start with you, George, and just say, you know, what words of wisdom would you give to somebody that's listening today with respect to trying to implement CMMC at whatever level they need to? Some people on the call may be, you know, a level 1. They may just have to do basic cyber hygiene, but even they are going to have some costs associated with it, and you know, are looking to find any nuggets of wisdom that they can. So, you know, give us a couple of nuggets here.
Number one, don't kick the can. This is not going away, right? You cannot wish your problems away. And as much as yet another audit is unwelcome potentially to you from a financial time and everything, it's not going away. Cybersecurity in the DoD space is paramount. That's where this is pivoting to. So you need to be proactive. Number two, be familiar with the framework and the controls. It's really important that you are familiar with it. challenge yourself, challenge your staff, and validate your assumptions around your understanding and your understanding about your internal compliance. It's better off to have a member of your staff say, you know, George, we said we did this, but I read through this and I'm not sure that I agree that we're compliant. I'd rather have someone internally tell me, you know, we've looked through it and we need to make some adjustments. You don't want an auditor saying to you, yeah, this is where you're at. So be proactive and look at those controls and assume that the auditor is coming tomorrow so that you're ready. And then you've built it, you've got that budget for it, and it's part of your day-to-day work plan. So that would be my advice is start now, don't be afraid of it, and don't be complacent.
Fantastic. Great nuggets. Jason.
First, I think the most important thing for all this that we all have to remember is this is for national security. We're Americans and we have to protect our defense information, and this is what it's all about. I'm sure the DoD quickly discovered that certification is not working. And so it's better to require you have a third party auditing. I don't think just for the audit itself, people I know are worried about cost. Depending on, you need to get 3 different quotes, maybe 4 different quotes from different companies. The cost for the audit to me shouldn't be that bad. It's not something really to worry about. But like George said, you don't want to wait till you kick the can down the road and then all of a sudden you get an audit and then you find out that you're 10% compliant and you've got to spend $200,000 on hardware and services to bring yourself up to just NIST compliance. But in all this, I highly recommend bringing, like George said, get a pre-audit for your CMMC, see where you stand at, and then you can make a better guess on where you've got to go, what it's going to cost, and to get fully compliant. Because otherwise, you're not going to be able to get a contract.
Gotcha. Brad, round us out here.
Sure. I kind of state the same thing as Jason and George. I mean, really, it comes down to having at least an audit done on what you currently have and seeing what the cost associated with it is to get to what level you want to be at. You got to ask yourself, what is the cost of not having it? And I think we discussed that earlier. You need to figure out what your business model is going to be, if you're going to continue down this path with the CMMC, or it's going to be something you can't afford at this time, and decide whether you want to keep moving forward. I also have to state that it was a learning curve with the personnel as well here. It's not just the IT staff, it's the daily users that had to really change their processes. Thankfully, our IT staff kept us in the loop pretty good on what was coming up the pipeline, how our processes were going to change. I mean, we laugh about the USB thing, but that was a big deal back in the day, swapping that over. I can't even tell you that was very difficult, especially with the engineering group here, on being able to move data very quickly between, different systems on and off the network. Now we're back to, 2000 burning CDs and things like that. There's just a lot of other laborious hours that generate from having the CMMC compliance that you now also have to be aware of when you're bidding contracts and things like that. Extra labor that has to happen.
Right. Great points. Now, one question that does come up when we talk about costs, are you hearing anything, because I know there was some buzz around it early on, of whether the DoD would allow some of these costs of compliance, the certification costs, particularly, to be allowable costs under contracts? Have you heard any more about that, either in fact or anecdotally, or anything out there on allowable costs, or is it just still, in your opinion, kind of where it was? So George, I'll start with you. Have you heard anything more on allowable costs?
So for us, the cost of cybersecurity is part of our G&A. So as long as it's an allowable part, then it makes up your overall rate structure. I have not personally heard that there's unallowable versus allowable costs. And for example, could you get an ODC on a contract to add there? I doubt it, that a contracting officer would do a mod. Again, I'm not a contracts expert and I'm not a finance expert, but if you have questions about that, I would look to your contracts in your finance department to see what is in there. But really, these are these are costs of conducting business that support the security of the data in support of the contract that ultimately make sure that that data is secure. So it would be proper that they should be allowable. Again, if you're going to get special dispensation, that's different. The one thing that I have heard is that if you're embarking on a CMMC initiative and you talk to your accounting firm, you may be able to capitalize those implementation costs. And that, you know, if you're familiar with CapEx versus OpEx and what that means, then that gives you some flexibility around your earnings. But from an allowable versus unallowable, couldn't give you any good data.
That's fair. Brad, Jason, anything to add there?
George, I agree completely. It's a G&A cost because especially with us, because we have so many sub companies, and then we have the parent company, and it would be highly unlikely a contracting officer would do that.
Okay, so last question here, and this is coming off of the Q&A, and without kind of mentioning names, Jason, you said you kind of had somebody come in and help. How did you go about finding that company? What were some of the criteria that you looked to with respect to bringing in that pre-audit assessor?
Yeah, that was very, very important. Basically what we did, we kind of treated it like the way we interview potential IT employees. You can say you have the experience, but we're going to pose questions to you that are going to force you to prove that you know what you're talking about. So we'd spent a good year and a half, we've pretty well understood the NIST controls, and after talking, we basically did interviews with different consulting companies and got quotes. But during those interviews, we discovered that the consulting companies seemed to not have as much knowledge about the NIST compliance as we did from doing our own work. But we did find one that was really good, very competitive priced, but they knew what they were talking about, and they helped us figure out this is what the control means, this is technically what you need to put in place. So once we kind of saw that and interviewed them, that's how we made our decision. And I highly recommend you do, other companies do the same thing. Interview at least 3 to 4 companies.
Okay, fantastic. So we're at the end here, and gentlemen, really appreciate your wisdom and your guidance here. I think the takeaway is CMMC is here. You need to, if you're going to do business with the DoD or be in that supply chain, you have to comply, and it's not a wait till later type thing. It's a here and now, get on it now. I think that's a fair summary. Is if you disagree with me, gentlemen, speak now or forever hold your peace. But I do appreciate you all getting on today, sharing your guidance. This has been invaluable in terms of just kind of the practical day-to-day, what people need to be thinking about. So again, thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Cassia here real quick, just to close us out, to give us one more time where you could go to get help, get specific questions answered, and where some of those resources that she mentioned at the front end, just mention those again. And then one last housekeeping thing, we are recording this, and so we will post it up so that if you need to go back and listen to something again, it will be there. So Cassia?
Thanks, Roy, and thank you all. This was exceptionally informative, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk to us about this. Again, I've learned many things from today. So a few things to remember: you can reach the recordings, including the recording that Roy referenced with the CMMC AB current chairman, Wayne Carlton Johnson, as well as Wayne Bolin, who's on the board, at the tagonline.org/GA-DIBT. All the recordings are housed there, as well as links to additional educational information. You can also reach me directly if you need any direction as to how to access some of our resources. I can be reached at cbaker@georgia.org. Again, cbaker@georgia.org. And I do manage our OEA grant initiatives around CMMC, and I'd be happy to help direct you to some resources. Again, the Cybersecurity Edge website is very important to save on your browser. You can reach that georgia.org/cybersecurity edge. And as Roy mentioned, this session is recorded and we will make sure it's up on the TAG website shortly. Please follow TAG Online's schedule of events to see our October and November events that are upcoming. And lastly, again, thank you to Jason, Brad, and George for all of your expertise, and to Roy Hadley.
Thank
Thank you all. Take care.